Welcome to Classes in Session Summer School with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Year in and year out, we are still stunned when the next violent hazing episode gets exposed. We marvel at its extent. We are shocked by the sheer inhumanity. And maybe most present is the need to ask the following question: how does this keep happening? Hazing is an extension of acceptance with power dynamics that flow from novices to seniors, from the haves to the have-nots. It lives in many sports cultures, just below the surface of tradition, but just above the surface of criminal violence. Universities have often been at the center of it, places of higher education that contain the turf for the inflammation of the worst of our lowest common denominator. And its culture continues. Our understanding will be shaped by our esteemed guest, Adam Rittenberg, ESPN college football journalist and insider, a Northwestern graduate who is covering the most recent scandal at his alma mater, and Dr. Susan Lipkins, pioneering psychologist with deep national expertise in hazing, bullying, and harassment. Dr. Lipkins has been an expert witness on a number of hazing cases. Let's get to class. There is a thin line between ritual and hazing, a line that is often bent in the hopes of forming a circle. Inside that circle is the ultimate privacy of team, a place of bonding and unity, insider culture, and protective order. Yet lurking in the shadows is a desperate quest for acceptance, with the ugly truth that many will remain outside of that circle, friend or foe. It ferments a toxic brew of using identity to harm, with a dash of generational hierarchy, veterans and rookies, stars, and also rands. This perpetual dance for belonging has roots that can be innocuous, some would argue necessary. It lays the foundation for immutable structures to be built, given dimension to time-honored traditions that draw the lines both into the past and into the future, until time itself is connected. However, this through line can mask the insider-outsider culture that can expose the three roles in something more nefarious: hazing, the victim, the bystander, the perpetrators, a blend of the new arrivals, survivors, and enactors that add their own seasoning, en route to seasoning the next generation into their heritage. It would appear that some of the traits deemed important to be a high-performance athlete can be developed in such a cauldron. We must endure pain and uncertainty, we say. As an athlete, we must prove our worth. We must carry a torch of the past and pass it on without hesitation or disloyalty. We are left with deep and shocking allegations of poisonous cultures, choking the air from the trust we all place in our institution and in our coaches. It infects brain trust schools like Northwestern or Harvard. It soaks national championship campuses from Baylor to Alabama. It spares no one, no place. Often, when a new allegation of hazing comes to light, it horrifies. The betrayal, the blind faith trampled, until the young adults are unrecognizable to themselves or to their families outside of the circle. Policy laws organizations have fought to rein in the worst-case scenarios. According to Stop Hazing, 45 out of 50 states have some form of hazing laws on the books. The application of these laws vary widely, with an equally wide-ranging impact. On the desk of Congress is the REACH Act, or Report and Educate About Campus Hazing Act. Whether local, state, or national in scope, hazing is a ritual that has endured many efforts to stop it. It lives on through a human need for belonging, but instead of turning that need into the embrace of the best of teamwork, hazing exploits it into a spark for the cycle of abuse that damages those who remain on the outside and suffocates those on the inside, until the team is nothing more than a prison of silence and dangerous power draped in school colors. Can we lift the haze? Let's welcome in our esteemed guest, Dr. Susan Lipkins, renowned psychologist with a specialty around hazing, bullying, and harassment. Has been an expert witness on many cases to help educate us around the culture of hazing. She has a book. She also is responsible for Inside Hazing. Her book on preventing hazing is a guidebook for how to approach what is a toxic culture that continues to rear its ugly head. Dr. Lipkins, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start at the core of just understanding and just defining hazing. Sometimes the lines are so blurred, and I just want to give our audience a shot to understand how you define it as an expert.
Okay, that's a good question because everybody defines it differently. So that means each state has their own definition. Most of the colleges have their own definition. Most of the fraternities and sororities have their own policy and definition. So my definition is that hazing is a process based on a tradition that's used by groups to maintain the pecking order or to discipline. Any of the activities that are associated with hazing are either physically or psychologically harmful or potentially harmful. There is no such thing as consent. So what that means is that if somebody wants to join a football team or a debate club or a marching band, that's all they want to do. And if they get hazed, they haven't agreed to be hazed. So they can't be blamed as the victim for having been hazed.
And I love that assessment that it's a process. It feels dynamic. It feels it's in action. It's in motion, so to speak. Can you talk about this transference of power that sort of lives in this? It's methodical, it's corrosive, but then how does this transfer of power work between sort of the groups involved?
Okay, so I think I agree. I'm glad you're bringing this up. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end. Hazing occurs usually over time. It starts out mildly and then it becomes more moderate and eventually it's really intense and then it's severe. I have something I call the blueprint of hazing. And what that means is you come in, all you want to do, you're innocent, you want to play ball or you want to play your musical instrument and you join the team. You're victimized and you're hazed and then you become a bystander and you watch as other people get hazed. Eventually, it's your turn. Now you're a senior member, you have power, and you feel like you have the right and the duty to pass on the tradition. So you do unto others what was done to you.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the myths around hazing, the sense of, oh, well, people welcomed it. They wanted to be part of the team. They understood this happened before. I guess what are the key myths that we need to dispel, like out of hand, about hazing culture in general?
Well, I think the most important one is what goes on in the locker room stays in the locker room, which is code word for the code of silence. So there's nothing stronger, I don't think, in hazing than the code of silence. Whatever the hazing culture is, whatever those traditions and rituals are, you do not tell anybody about it. And the reason you don't tell it is because everybody knows that it's either illegal or immoral or possibly physically or psychologically harmful. So nobody wants to get caught.
And so within keeping and maintaining this code, what are the rewards, I guess, offered to why people feel like they need to perpetuate it?
Well, there are two things. One is they need to be accepted by the team or the group that's hazing. And so what happens at the end of a hazing versus a bullying is you're accepted into the group. In a bullying situation, the bully actually gets something. Maybe they get your homework or they get some social status or they get money. But in a hazing, it's a group process. It's planned before you've even gotten there because they do it every year. So they know where they're going to do it. There's that beginning, that middle, and the end. And at the end, there's a celebration. And now you're one of us. See, you've proven that you're worthy to be in the group. Now, I just have to sort of do a sidebar, which is whatever the hazing is has nothing to do with being in the group. In other words, it's not going to make you a better football player. It's not going to make you a better marching band. It's not going to make you a better frat person. It's completely irrelevant to what you're actually doing. But the group has defined this hazing as saying, see, you're now one of us.
Coming up, dispelling the myths around hazing and the need to belong on a team. We'll be right back on Classes in Session Summer School with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Welcome back to Classes in Session Summer School with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. There's sort of this thinly veiled perception, maybe not always thinly veiled, of like a positive a takeaway from hazing. Maybe it's not called hazing, right? But the sense of like, okay, I'm an athlete. I need to develop my pain tolerance, right? I need to be tougher when I get here to this university, to wherever. I need to, prove that I'm going to have your back. I guess, what do you say to that? And like, how do we tackle the fact that there is a counterculture that kind of endorses elements of it?
Okay, so I don't quite agree with you. Here's what I think happens. The coaches feel like hazing bonds. And I think the myth that you're talking about is that you need to haze in order to bond the team. And that to me is a myth that's not true. The kinds of hazing that I have seen in athletic programs, in fraternities, in marching bands, as I said, had nothing to do with actually what you're doing. If you're having the car wash at Northwestern and somebody's genitals are being rubbed against you, that's not going to make you a better quarterback. There is very little that going on in the hazing tradition that has anything to make you feel like you're going to have my back. So I think that it's not a counterculture. I think it's our larger culture, because when a hazing is reported, 85% of that campus or of that community will support the coach. They will support the status quo. They will support the hazing as is. 15% will support the victim. 15% will have their back or actually go up against the 85% and say, no, this isn't right.
Well, Dr. Lipkin, what about the sort of future next steps? I mean, we talk about policy, there's law, legislation, there's pressure, media. However, I mean, what do you see as a way to improve these circumstances?
I wish I had a magic wand to change the face of the culture of hazing. I think that I was hoping that that the Northwestern football team and the victims who came forward, that they would start a movement cross country where all athletes in high school and college, both male and female, would start to have lawsuits, so that there would be a tsunami of lawsuits, enough that would actually get the attention of all the colleges and high schools and coaches to change their hazing culture. That if it was expensive enough in our culture, then people start to pay attention. So that would be a wish. I don't think it's going to happen, but that would be great if it did.
Well, Dr. Lipkins, I really, really appreciate your incredible insight. I've learned a lot. I know our audience has learned a lot. This is something that, unfortunately, we keep seeing more headlines of this, and hopefully at some point there's some, as you mentioned, tsunami or some sort of change that will allow it to change direction and go back up the hill to stay.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, very thankful to have our next guest, Adam Rittenberg. It's a pleasure, a fellow ESPN colleague, a senior writer for college football. He's covered the sport extensively. He also is a Northwestern graduate who are right now in the midst of the hazing scandal going on throughout the news media world. So, Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Doug. It's great to be here.
Well, so fascinating that not only, your reporting has been so extensive on what's happening at Northwestern, but being a graduate has put you right in the center of something that's, deeply personal as well. I guess, can you give us a sense of the sort of broad-based summary of what's happening to Northwestern with respect to hazing and where we are right now?
Sure. I can go back to when this began. There was a complaint that was filed by a former, or still a current player at the time, back in November, that outlined some hazing allegations. And that set off a investigation that the university did, hiring a investigator and a law firm outside the school to conduct a hazing investigation that really began in earnest in January, was announced to the media. But then we didn't hear a whole lot about this until, right after the 4th of July, when the university released an executive summary of that investigation and included some penalties or some corrective measures, including a 2-week suspension for longtime head coach Pat Fitzgerald. Well, the next day, the Daily Northwestern reported really the allegations in detail that this former player at the time had left the school, told the investigators, and that certainly set off a incredible reaction and set of events that led to Fitzgerald being fired on that following Monday. And since then, there's been obviously a lot of attention on not just the football program, but the entire athletic program.
Well, Adam, it just seems like there's something different about this Northwestern case. And I guess, can you touch on how in your reporting, was there anything that really stood out in terms of a revelation that said, wait a minute, this is a little bit different? Like, how did we get to this point?
Right. I think, in speaking to the whistleblower, the initial whistleblower, a day after, the allegations were out in the Daily Northwestern, I was struck by how prepared he was in listing the different things that he said either happened to him or that he witnessed. And it was almost like he had an opening statement ready to go with a lot of details. Not a lot of names, but a lot of details about things he said happened in the program. I really think that a lot of what's happened since then, Doug, has almost been a template based off of what that person said. There have been some new allegations that have come to light, some involving race, some involving, other things. And so I think also just the reaction to those allegations, because some of the details and the incidents were so shocking. And again, really not fitting with the type of program that Pat Fitzgerald had, and that the image of that program, that was certainly part of a big part of shaping the overall nature of the story.
We continue with our in-depth look into the collegiate hazing epidemic and what guardrails can be installed to eradicate it. Next on Classes in Session Summer School with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Welcome back to Classes in Session Summer School with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Well, and I think there's also perception of, you have Northwestern, a tremendous academic institution, probably, more known initially through that. Their sports programs have flourished in many ways up until certainly this moment. What do you think about the mythology around certain schools, the Stanfords, these Ivy League schools and so on?
Right. Yeah, I think I think Northwestern certainly care. One thing that's come across to me in talking to a number of sources, and I knew this having gone there, is that Northwestern, really does care about its reputation and will always put its academic reputation over, necessarily the athletic situation. I really believe, Doug, in covering college football nationally, that there's a lot of programs that would have approached the Pat Fitzgerald situation differently and would have found a way to keep him as their head coach. I think the bigger question is what really went on, and why was it not discovered by people who objectively could look at it and say, this is going too far. This is something that shouldn't be happening here. We need to ensure that this doesn't happen again, so that other athletes or whoever is involved don't feel the way that a number of athletes at Northwestern have felt.
Yeah, and can you speak to that sense of the difference between ritual, tradition, and then how this has sort of moved into this toxic line crossing?
Right. So the one allegation, again, made from the initial whistleblower that has gained the most attention, rightfully so, is this practice of running, where individuals, usually younger players, would be singled out by older teammates and restrained in the locker room, while others would engage in kind of sexualized acts towards them. Again, which really, by the letter of the law, constitutes sexual assault. You're restraining somebody and engaging in sexualized behavior against their will. I mean, that's a crime. And then there's some team traditions that have been presented as offensive that I just don't agree with. I mean, there was a headline recently about a watermelon eating contest that I've witnessed that I just don't believe that was something that was that constituted mistreatment. Maybe some have. I think it's a bit of piggybacking onto the initial allegations, which certainly are more serious. So there's sort of levels of this that again are open to interpretation. But if the running in particular, that activity is what was alleged, this is not a small group activity. This is not a hidden activity. This is something that, again, if those allegations are true, should have been seen and should have been stopped, because I don't know how you can look at that and say, oh, that's just messing around.
Northwestern has brought in the former Attorney General Loretta Lynch to really be part of this sort of legal investigation, if I'm characterizing it correctly. Do you see this type of move as what? Is this real change? What do you think this is meant to accomplish for Northwestern?
Right. So, keep in mind the original investigation was based off of a single complaint from a whistleblower. And we have not seen it. And I think that's one of the big mysteries in this whole story, Doug, is what was in the full report, because it may not have looked that bad for Pat Fitzgerald. It may have looked really bad for Pat Fitzgerald. All we know is that much of the allegations were corroborated in some form during that investigation. Now we've had all these other allegations and lawsuits and other sports mentioned. So I think the idea of the Loretta Lynch investigation is to look at how Northwestern approaches these types of situations in all of its teams.
I mean, it seems like every day you pull something up and then there's like another sport. I mean, it's not, often, you think of football, there's big programs, but so many other sports. And you think of Harvard, for example, the women's ice hockey team, similar dichotomy. What do you think happens here in terms of Northwestern and sort of the next steps?
Right. Well, I think it's interesting to think about, what team traditions can even remain at Northwestern. I think it's going to be very difficult for Northwestern and maybe many other teams to kind of keep a lot of those things in place before, during, or after the season. I think there's an expectation, Doug, that Northwestern will look very different as a program next year and in the coming years, from the head coach to the coaching staff. A lot of the players will be different.
Well, Adam, really very much appreciate your insight. I know you're very close to this story as your alma mater, but your insight has been tremendous. And hopefully our audience will take a lot from this to be able to look at their institutions and try to make sure they're healthy for everyone.
No doubt. And that's certainly the goal here after a very difficult time that Northwestern's trying to accomplish, and we'll find out how successful they are. But it's certainly great to be with you. Really enjoyed the conversation, Doug.
It is apparent that hazing has too much momentum in a mainstream culture, one that gains sustenance from its existence. Its trajectory of raising the bar can only be reversed with a tsunami of change. We have found that hazing is a venomous version of our inextricable need for belonging. It operates in a vicious cycle between the beginning, the middle, and the end. Newcomers to veterans. Participating is not a requirement of being a good ball player, but it still lives on through group dynamics in order to maintain a culture of power that is ceaseless in its thirst. Over time, each generation, each iteration of team leadership feels compelled and empowered to put its signature on today's culture, one-upping the past, immortalizing the present. However, what of the future for those who have lived through the pain of hazing? Those that endure often perpetuate the cycle of abuse, damaging others, and in denial. We cannot stop our need to be part of a group, a family, a team. It's in our nature, but we can do better in drawing the line when that need is turned against us. But will we? I'm Doug Glanville. See you next time.